Disclaimer: the following story is based on an account that the narrator claims to be entirely true. Names, places, and certain details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved. Some may dismiss this as folklore or superstition, but to the person who lived through it, this was not a dream, a hallucination, or a figment of imagination. This was real. Listener discretion is strongly advised, not because of blood, gore, or violence, but because once you hear it, you may find yourself thinking twice about what's waiting in the dark corners of your own home. Claire had never thought she would leave the city. She loved the constant hum of life, the way streetlights painted the sidewalks in warm amber at night, the safety of noise and people all around. But when her life in Chicago began crumbling, her long-term relationship ending, her job laying her off, her savings dwindling faster than she could manage, she found herself looking for something, anything, that felt like a fresh start. That's when she stumbled upon the listing. It was a Victorian home in a rural part of Pennsylvania. The photos made it look like something out of an old novel: ornate wooden banisters, high ceilings, stained glass windows that caught the morning sun in a mosaic of colors. The rent was shockingly low, almost suspiciously so. Claire joked to herself that there had to be a catch, maybe bad plumbing or a roof that leaked like a sieve. Still, she emailed the landlord, and within a week, the keys were in her hands. The drive there was long, winding through stretches of forest and empty road. It felt like she was heading not just away from the city, but away from the rest of the world. By the time she pulled up to the house, the sky was turning shades of orange and pink. It stood on a small hill, surrounded by bare oak trees that creaked in the wind. Even from a distance, Claire noticed the way the house seemed, different from its surroundings. Not neglected exactly, but heavy, as if it carried the weight of its own history. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and something older, something she couldn't place. The wooden floors groaned under her steps, but the rooms were surprisingly clean. The kitchen had old brass fixtures, the living room a massive fireplace, and upstairs, the bedrooms had bay windows that looked out over the yard. It wasn't perfect. The wallpaper in some rooms was peeling, and there were odd scratches along the door frames, but Claire convinced herself these were quirks, not flaws. The first night was quiet, unnervingly so. In the city, there was always background noise, sirens, cars, the hum of traffic. Here, there was nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Claire lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of that silence pressing down. She reminded herself that it was just the adjustment, that anyone moving from a city to the countryside would feel the difference. By morning, the unease had faded. She spent the next few days unpacking, setting up her kitchen, and exploring the property. There was a small garden out back, long overgrown, and a narrow door that led to the basement. She didn't bother opening it right away. Basements had never been her favorite places, and besides, she had enough to focus on upstairs. The locals were polite but distant. When she stopped at the only diner in town for coffee, conversations seemed to pause when she entered. A few people asked where she was staying, and when she mentioned the Victorian on Hillcrest Road, she noticed subtle shifts in their expressions, a tightening of the mouth, a glance exchanged between two older men. It was nothing outright hostile, but it was there, that flicker of something unsaid. At night, Claire sometimes caught herself staring at the darkened hallway outside her bedroom door. The house had a way of feeling alert, as though it was listening. But she reminded herself it was just an old structure settling, creaking, breathing the way old houses did. She had come here for a new life, and she was determined to make it work. Still, there was one thing she couldn't shake. Every time she passed the basement door, she felt a subtle, inexplicable chill. Not enough to stop her in her tracks, but enough to make her quicken her pace. Enough to make her think, without knowing why, "Don't go down there." It started small, so small that Claire told herself she was imagining it. On the fifth night, she was curled up on the couch with a blanket, reading, when she heard a faint sound from upstairs. It wasn't a creak or the usual sigh of an old house. It was softer, like the hush of fabric brushing against the floorboards, followed by a low murmur she couldn't quite make out. She froze, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, but when she strained to listen, the sound was gone. The next day, while unpacking boxes in the living room, Claire noticed something strange. The door to the basement, which she always kept closed, was slightly ajar. She was sure she hadn't touched it, she'd been avoiding the basement entirely. The gap was narrow, just enough to see darkness beyond. She shut it quickly, telling herself the latch was probably loose and it had swung open on its own. Still, she found herself checking it again before going to bed that night, making sure it was firmly closed. That same night, she woke to the sound of breathing. It was faint but unmistakable, slow, heavy, almost labored, as though someone was standing just outside her bedroom door. Claire held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, the glow of the screen casting pale light into the room. She wanted to believe it was her imagination, that maybe she'd been dreaming, but the breathing went on for what felt like a full minute before fading away. When she finally worked up the courage to check, the hallway was empty. By the end of the first week, the strangeness had become harder to ignore. Shadows seemed to move against the light in ways they shouldn't. More than once, she caught sight of something flicker at the edge of her vision, not a person exactly, but a dark shape that dissolved when she turned her head. During the day, it was easier to dismiss these moments, but at night, the house felt alive. On Saturday, she was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard a sharp knock from somewhere inside the house. It wasn't the front door. It sounded like it came from the floor beneath her feet, the basement. She froze, her hand tightening around the mug. The knock came again, slow and deliberate, as though someone was tapping just once every few seconds. She told herself it had to be the pipes, or maybe a branch brushing the side of the house, but the sound seemed too precise, too intentional. The real turning point came the following night. Claire had just drifted off to sleep when she woke to the faint sound of whispering. It wasn't just one voice, it was several, overlapping, like a dozen people speaking in hushed tones. She sat up, heart pounding, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be seeping through the floor from somewhere below her. Her eyes darted to the basement door at the end of the hallway. She wanted to believe she was just hearing the wind, maybe the trees outside. But as she lay there, listening, the whispers grew clearer, though still in a language she couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped, replaced by that same heavy, wet breathing she'd heard before, this time closer, as though it was just inches from her bedroom wall. By now, sleep came only in fragments, interrupted by strange noises and the feeling of being watched. Even in broad daylight, there were moments when she'd feel something behind her, a shift in the air, a subtle pressure at the back of her neck, making her turn around to find nothing there. Still, Claire told herself it was just the stress of moving, the isolation of the countryside, maybe even leftover anxiety from her life in the city. She tried to stay rational, to keep her feet on the ground. But deep down, she knew the truth she didn't want to admit. Something in that house was aware of her. And whatever it wasn't content to stay hidden for long. It was a Tuesday morning when Claire first spoke with the neighbor. She had been outside trimming some overgrown ivy near the front steps when she noticed a figure standing at the end of her driveway, an elderly woman in a faded blue cardigan, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. She clutched a grocery bag in one hand, and her eyes were fixed on the house in a way that made Claire pause. "Morning," Claire called out, brushing dirt from her hands. The woman didn't immediately respond. She glanced toward Claire, then back to the house, almost as if she were debating whether to speak. Finally, she took a few cautious steps forward. "You're renting the Hillcrest place, aren't you?" Her voice was soft, but carried an edge of something, wariness, maybe even pity. Claire smiled politely. "Yeah, moved in about a week ago. I'm Claire." The woman nodded, though she didn't offer her name right away. "I live 2 houses down," she said finally. "My name's Martha." She hesitated, her gaze drifting once more to the upper windows. "Haven't seen anyone live here in, goodness, must be 15 years now." Claire frowned. "Really? The landlord said it had been vacant for a while, but I didn't realize it was that long." Martha shifted the grocery bag in her hands. Long enough that most folks around here stopped talking about it. Easier that way. The words were vague, but something in Martha's tone made the air feel heavier. Claire tried to keep her voice casual. Why's that? Bad plumbing? Ghost stories? She gave a small laugh, hoping to lighten the mood. Martha didn't laugh. There was a girl, she said slowly, as if each word cost her something. Her name was Lily Thompson. 19 years old. She lived here with her parents in the early 80s. One night, she went missing. Police searched for weeks, no sign of her. People said she'd run off, but Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the shaded porch as if expecting to see something there. Some of us knew better. Claire's chest tightened. Knew better. They never found her body, Martha continued. But they found things in the basement. Blood, scratch marks on the walls, deep enough to splinter the wood. Her parents swore they didn't know what happened, but that house hasn't been right since. Claire tried to keep her expression neutral, but she felt a cold ripple down her spine. You think it's haunted? She asked, half joking, half curious. Martha's gaze locked on hers. I think there's something in that house that isn't human. And I think it's been there longer than any of us realize. There was a long silence between them, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Finally, Martha glanced toward the road. If you're smart, you'll leave before it notices you. Claire swallowed, unsure how to respond. She wanted to brush it off as small-town superstition, the kind of ghost story older folks told to scare newcomers. But there was something unsettling in Martha's expression, a certainty, as if she'd seen something herself. I'll keep that in mind, Claire said, forcing a smile. Martha nodded once, then turned to leave. As she walked away, she called back without looking over her shoulder, and whatever you do, don't go into the basement after dark. The rest of the day, Claire tried to shake the conversation from her mind. She told herself Martha was just being dramatic. Maybe she'd lost someone once, and this was her way of warning strangers to be careful. But that night, as Claire passed the basement door on her way to bed, she found herself pausing. The wood seemed darker than usual, as though it absorbed the light from the hallway. Her hand twitched toward the doorknob, but she pulled it back and forced herself to keep walking. Upstairs, lying in bed, her thoughts kept circling back to what Martha had said, before it notices you. Claire didn't know what it was, but the idea of being noticed by something she couldn't understand left a knot in her stomach. By midnight, sleep still wouldn't come. And that was when she heard it again, the slow, deliberate sound of breathing from somewhere below her. This time, she didn't even try to tell herself it was the wind. 3 nights after Martha's warning, Claire experienced something she couldn't explain away. The day had been uneventful. She'd spent most of it cleaning and trying to make the house feel more like home. By evening, a storm rolled in, the kind with low, growling thunder that seemed to linger in the distance before bursting overhead. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind whistled through unseen gaps in the walls. Claire had always liked storms in the city. There was comfort in watching them from a high-rise apartment, knowing the noise of traffic and life was still below. But here, the sound felt different, too close, too raw. The house seemed to groan and shift with every gust of wind, the shadows in the corners twitching as lightning flashed. She decided to go to bed early. Wrapping herself in a blanket, she lay listening to the rain hammering the roof. At first, the rhythm was almost calming, but somewhere between the roll of thunder and the patter of rain, another sound began to creep in. Faint, distant, but unmistakable, the creak of wooden steps. At first, she thought it was coming from the staircase leading upstairs. She held her breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, not from above, but from beneath her. Slow, deliberate. The unmistakable echo of someone walking up the basement stairs. Claire sat up, her pulse pounding in her ears. She told herself it could be the house settling, or maybe water dripping somewhere below. But the sound was too regular, too heavy. Each step landed with a long pause before the next, as though whoever or whatever was climbing had no need to hurry. The noise reached the last step. Then silence. Claire's eyes darted to her bedroom door. The basement door was at the far end of the hallway. If something had come through, she would have heard it open. But she hadn't. After several seconds that stretched into what felt like minutes, she climbed out of bed, moving slowly so the floor wouldn't creak under her feet. She grabbed her phone, using its flashlight to cut a narrow beam of light into the hallway. The storm outside made the shadows seem alive, dancing in the periphery of her vision. The basement door was closed. But something about it looked wrong. Claire realized her own breathing had quickened, and she was holding the phone too tightly. She took a tentative step forward, then another, until she was standing in front of the door. The metal knob was cold, far colder than it should have been for the middle of summer. She leaned forward, pressing her ear against the wood. At first, there was nothing. Then a sound so faint she almost missed it, a slow exhale, wet and ragged, coming from the other side. Claire's stomach tightened. She stepped back quickly, nearly tripping over herself as she turned and retreated to her room. She locked the door, though she knew it wouldn't matter if something really wanted to come in. She stayed awake for hours, listening. Occasionally, she thought she heard faint scratching, but it was impossible to tell over the storm. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. When she woke the next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, and the world outside looked harmless again. She told herself she'd been imagining things, that the storm had played tricks on her ears. But when she passed the basement door, she noticed something she couldn't ignore, the faint outline of wet footprints leading from the bottom edge of the door into the hallway. They stopped halfway across the floor, vanishing as if whoever had made them had simply disappeared. Claire stood there for a long moment, her chest tightening, before forcing herself to grab her keys and leave the house. She didn't have a destination in mind, only the urge to be somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't inside those walls. That evening, when she returned, the footprints were gone. The wood was dry, clean, as if nothing had ever been there. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the house was aware of her fear and that it liked it. Claire had never been the curious type when it came to things that scared her. As a kid, she avoided horror movies and refused to play hide-and-seek in dark basements. But something about the last few nights gnawed at her. She felt like she was being pushed toward the truth, that ignoring whatever was happening would only make it worse. 2 days after the storm, she decided to see the basement in daylight. It was a bright afternoon, the kind where the sun seemed almost too hot for the season. She told herself this was the safest time to go, when shadows were weakest, and whatever might be hiding down there would have nowhere to conceal itself. The door creaked when she opened it, the sound echoing down into the darkness below. A wave of cold air swept over her, smelling faintly of mildew and something else, something rotten, like meat left out too long. Claire gagged, but forced herself to keep going. She flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb was either burnt out or dead for some other reason. She used her phone's flashlight instead, the narrow beam cutting into the blackness as she descended the wooden steps. Each one groaned under her weight, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being listened to. When she reached the bottom, the air was colder still, unnatural for summer. Dust floated in the beam of light, and cobwebs hung in thick sheets from the ceiling. The basement seemed ordinary at first glance: concrete floor, old workbench, a few rusted tools, and a washing machine that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But as she scanned the far wall, her light caught something odd. A thin vertical crack ran from floor to ceiling, and the wall itself looked different, like it had been patched over hastily. She walked closer, running her hand along the surface. The wall sounded hollow when she knocked on it. Her pulse quickened. She found an old hammer on the workbench and began tapping at the edges. After a few strikes, part of the plaster crumbled away, revealing a narrow gap. Claire hesitated. Every instinct told her to stop, to turn around and pretend she hadn't seen it. But she forced herself to widen the hole, enough to peer through. Beyond was another room, one that hadn't appeared on the house's floor plan. The hidden space was small, barely big enough to stand in. Her flashlight swept across the walls, and she saw deep, ragged gouges in the wood, as if something with claws had tried and failed to escape. In the far corner sat a chair with one leg broken, surrounded by what looked like dark stains on the floor. The smell was overpowering now, thick and sweet in the worst possible way. Claire stepped inside, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The air felt heavier here, like it was pressing against her skin. There was a faint sound, too, almost like breathing, but not quite. It was as if the room itself was alive. In the center of the floor lay a small bundle of fabric, filthy and stiff with age. She crouched down and, with trembling hands, unfolded it. Inside was a necklace, a silver chain with a tiny heart-shaped pendant, tarnished but still intact. She didn't know how she knew, but the name Lily seemed to whisper itself into her mind the moment she touched it. Suddenly, the cold in the room deepened, and Claire's light flickered. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. For just a split second, she thought she saw movement in the shadows, something tall, hunched, with elongated limbs, standing in the far corner. But when the light steadied, the space was empty. Her hands shook as she backed out of the room, dropping the pendant in her pocket without thinking. She climbed the stairs quickly, not daring to look behind her. Once upstairs, she slammed the basement door shut and locked it. She tried to calm herself, but the image of that hidden room clung to her thoughts. The claw marks, the stains, the smell, and that feeling that something in the dark had been watching her the entire time. That night, she barely slept. And when she did, she dreamt of a pair of black, lidless eyes staring at her from just beyond the basement door. The night after Claire found the hidden room, the house felt different. Heavier. Every creak of the floorboards seemed deliberate, as if the house were leaning in to hear her every move. She had locked the basement door and shoved a chair under the knob, but it did little to ease the gnawing dread in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that by going down there, by touching that pendant, she had woken something up. She tried to keep busy. She made dinner, left the TV on for background noise, scrolled endlessly on her phone. But every now and then, she caught herself glancing at the hallway. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, clinging to the walls like oil. Around midnight, she decided to go to bed, hoping exhaustion would finally drag her into sleep. But an hour later, she jolted awake. At first, she thought it was because she'd heard something, a faint click, like the sound of a door latch releasing. She held her breath, listening. The air in the room felt thicker, colder. Then came the breathing. Slow, wet, labored. Not from the hallway this time. From inside the room. Claire's heart thundered against her ribs. She fumbled for her phone on the nightstand, the blue-white glow spilling across her sheets. Her first instinct was to point the flashlight toward the door, but the sound wasn't coming from there. It was coming from the foot of the bed. She turned the light slowly, her pulse roaring in her ears. And that's when she saw it. The figure was impossibly tall, hunched forward so that its elongated arms brushed the floor. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over its bones, almost translucent in places. Where its eyes should have been were two black pits, deep and empty, but somehow still fixed on her. Its mouth was open in a grin too wide to be human, revealing teeth that were jagged and far too long. The creature didn't move at first. It just stood there, breathing that slow, wet breath. Then, in a voice that didn't sound like one voice at all, more like dozens speaking in unison, it whispered her name. Claire. She scrambled back until her shoulders hit the headboard, clutching her phone like a weapon. Her flashlight flickered, and for a heartbeat, the creature seemed to vanish into the dark, only to reappear closer, its face now level with hers. The smell hit her then, a sickening blend of rot and damp earth, so strong it made her gag. Its grin widened, and it tilted its head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. Claire's mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't move. The thing reached out with one of its skeletal hands, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with nails that looked more like claws. It stopped just short of touching her, as if savoring the moment. Then, without warning, the creature leaned close enough that she could feel its breath on her cheek. "You found my room," it hissed, the words vibrating through her bones. That broke her paralysis. Claire threw herself sideways off the bed, hitting the floor hard and scrambling toward the door. She didn't look back. She tore down the hallway, nearly tripping over her own feet, and yanked the front door open. The night air was cold and wet against her skin, the ground still slick from an earlier rain. She didn't stop running until she reached the road, her breath ragged, her heart pounding so violently it hurt. She stood there, shaking, staring back at the dark silhouette of the house. The upstairs window to her bedroom was open now, curtains fluttering outward as if something inside was watching her. And though she couldn't see it clearly in the dark, she knew. The creature was standing there, waiting. Claire didn't stop running that night until her legs gave out. She ended up half-collapsed on the porch of the small diner she'd visited her first week in town. It was well past 2 in the morning, and the place was closed, but the neon open sign inside flickered faintly as if mocking her. She pounded on the glass until the night cook, a wiry man with tired eyes, appeared from the back. He unlocked the door, taking one look at her pale, trembling face before stepping aside to let her in. "You look like hell," he muttered, but his tone wasn't unkind. "What happened?" She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. Her throat was raw from breathing so hard, her hands shaking too much to hold the glass of water he handed her. "There's something in my house," she finally whispered. He didn't ask for details. Instead, he poured her another glass, slid it across the counter, and said, "You need to get out of here. That place isn't right. Everyone in this town knows it." By sunrise, she had convinced herself not to go back, not even for her things. The idea of walking into that house again, of feeling that crushing cold and seeing those black, empty eyes, made her chest tighten until she could hardly breathe. She called the landlord from the diner's payphone, telling him she was breaking the lease immediately. He didn't argue, didn't even ask for an explanation. Just said, "Leave the keys in the mailbox," and hung up. It took all her courage to return in daylight. Even then, the house looked different, not abandoned, not damaged, but waiting. The front door was still ajar from when she'd fled, but the moment she stepped inside, the air felt thick and heavy, pressing against her skin. She kept her eyes on the floor, moving quickly toward the kitchen where the mailbox key sat. She left her own keys there without looking toward the hallway or the basement door. Still, she couldn't help but notice something as she passed the living room. The basement door was wide open. She didn't dare glance down the stairs. Instead, she turned and hurried out, pulling the front door closed behind her. The moment the latch clicked, she felt an almost physical release, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. That night, she stayed at a cheap motel off the highway, too wired to sleep. She left the TV on for noise, but in the quiet moments between commercials, she swore she could still hear it, the faint, wet breathing, just beyond the thin walls. Days turned into weeks, and Claire moved into a small apartment in another state. She told herself she was safe now, that whatever was in that house was trapped there, bound to its walls and its hidden room. But the dream started almost immediately. They were always the same. She was standing in the basement, the hidden room's false wall torn open. The creature was there, crouched in the corner, its grin stretching impossibly wide. It would tilt its head, whisper her name, and take one slow step toward her. That was when she'd wake, gasping for air, her heart slamming against her ribs. She began avoiding sleep altogether, drinking coffee late into the night, watching old TV reruns until exhaustion forced her under. But no matter how long she stayed awake, the dreams always returned. One morning, after yet another restless night, she found something on her kitchen counter that froze her in place, a small silver heart-shaped pendant, tarnished and cold to the touch. She hadn't brought anything from the house. Claire's breath came in short, shallow bursts as she backed away, her mind screaming with the realization. The monster hadn't been trapped in that house. It had followed her. In her dreams. It didn't have to. The way it looked at her was enough to tell her this wasn't over. Months later, while unpacking, she opened a box she hadn't touched since moving. Sitting on top of her folded sweaters was the pendant, shining as if it had been freshly polished. Claire didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at it for a long time, her mind settling into the terrible understanding that she would never be free. Some monsters aren't tied to places. Some find you. And once they do, they never let go. 3.